Good afternoon. This is Aaron Wissner of Local Future, and today we're going to find out, will the financial system collapse? What is going to happen to your pension? Will your retirement investments be there in the future? And other similar questions. On the line today, live, this is May the 21st, 2020. It is 2 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time in the United States. I have Gail Tverberg. Gail, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
Now, first, we're going to establish some credibility with Gail. And Gail, can you tell us, why are people following you? What is their interest in what you are saying and what you are writing?
Well, I have been investigating this story since basically about 2005. I come with a very different background than a lot of other people. I come as an actuary who has done forecasting for the insurance industry. And so I have some sort of a financial kind of background, but I got into the energy issues as well. And so I have managed to put together different pieces and come up with a completely different story. I've been telling people that the problem will be low prices rather than high prices. And the problem will be collapse, and it will affect the financial system. So it's a different story than the peak oil, we're going to run out of oil and the price will be too high story.
Is there any way just to tilt your camera down just a tiny bit so your head is closer to the top of the screen? Yeah, nice. Thank you. Gail, in the past year or so, has anyone invited you to speak at an event? And if so, who and why?
Well, I've spoken to several different groups. I've spoken to a group of life insurance reinsurers and pension reinsurers out in Bermuda. I've spoken to a group of different energy researchers. I talked to two different groups. One of them is associated with the IEEE, the engineering group, and another one is the ones who are involved with the energy return on energy invested. I've also talked to the casualty actuaries, which is where I come from, but of course with casualty actuaries, it's always this, people have more honor when they come from outside, and this is the expert from outside. If you're talking to your own people, everybody thinks, well, obviously I would know the same thing she does, so she can't possibly know anything. So that's not my primary focus. There are a number of people from the casualty actuarial group that follow what I say, but I actually have a lot more interest from people in many other areas that have been researching energy and forecasting and all of that kind of thing.
Do people follow you on a blog or something? And if so, who follows you?
Well, on the blog, I think I have a disproportionate number who have advanced degrees, but they're not advanced degrees in any one particular subject. So I have people who come and I have a fairly extensive comment section on my blog. And so what happens is I'm discussing a particular topic and people write in who have some ideas of things I should be looking at and additional references I should look at. So we discuss in the comments, what else is going on besides what I'm talking about. And sometimes I find that, my new post practically writes itself because so many of my commenters had said, you really ought to talk about this and that, and you've got this reference and that reference and the other reference.
Where can a viewer find your blog?
It's at ourfiniteworld.com. OurfiniteWorld.com. And the finite is important. I've had somebody introduce me as our infinite world. And the whole point is that our resources aren't infinite, they're finite.
Precisely. So how is it that you are associated with energy as an actuary?
Well, I didn't get into this really until I didn't start looking into the current problem until 2005. I had been around in 1974. I had seen what had happened to the insurance industry in 1974 when there were high oil prices and when the interest rates went way up. And I saw what happened to the balance sheets of insurance companies. And I recognized that if there were problems in energy, they affected insurance companies, they'd also affect banks. So I had been interested in this. Then when it started getting into the news again in 2005, that was when I started reading about it. I started writing about it, but not on the internet, I think in 2006.
And then how did that interest expand? So your audience, the number of people listening to you or grew?
Well, when I first started writing about it, I was working as an actuarial consultant for a consulting firm. And they had a periodical that they asked me to write an article for. And they said, could you write another article about medical malpractice? And I said, well, you know, I've written quite a few articles for you on medical malpractice before. I've got something else I'm interested in. Let me write something about the energy problem we're facing. And they said, well, yeah, if you can kind of figure out some way that we can get people interested in our consulting firm because of some knowledge you have, you know, you can write about it. Well, I wrote about that, and I wrote about another article for an actuarial magazine, Contingencies. But I could see in doing this that this was going to be a conflict of interest, because you can't write for a consulting firm that also does work on pensions, even if I wasn't a pension actuary. And you can't say things like, well, the economy is not really going to grow the way you expect it is, and interest rates aren't really going to stay high. This was not going to be something anybody's going to want to hear about, at least not from the point of view of the company that's trying to say that pensions are properly funded, for example. You know, if they have their own actuaries who are giving that information out, they don't want anybody on their staff suggesting they might be wrong. So I left consulting then and started doing, essentially took early retirement and started working on this.
And then you were associated with the very high amount of interest in oil prices in 2005 through about 2007, 8, 9. What was your role as a communicator during that time?
Well, I first started my own blog, Our Finite World, and then the people at the oil drum saw my writings and they said, you know, would you, could we copy some of your articles over? And I said, well, yeah, I guess you could copy some of my articles over. And so, and they encouraged me to write more. And then they wanted me to become on their staff. And I said, well, not till I leave, you know, working for the consulting firm full time. So I did that, and I hadn't been there very long. I left the consulting firm in 2007, and it might have been early 2008. They said, well, we really need an editor. And all of the other people were working part-time. I mean, some were graduate students and some were faculty members. They're mostly in academics. And so they really didn't quite have enough time to devote to this. And they said, hey, we got Gail there and she's not doing anything else. So maybe we can kind of push a few of these things off, you know, anyhow. And I kind of said, well, I really like researching things and writing it myself. I'm really not interested in getting into the management of this. And so, a month or two later, came back and said, well, the person who'd been kind of handling this said, I'm going on vacation for a week. Could you please cover for me for a week? And I said, well, I guess I could cover for you for a week. And so it was sort of at the end of the time as well, you did such a good job, I really, So anyhow, I ended up taking on more responsibility in terms of deciding what things ran, fixing them up, finding the mistakes in the articles, and having a good math background and being able to look at all the numbers myself probably gave me an in on that to begin with. So I found myself talking to other authors at the same time I was still writing articles for the oil drum. So people read my articles and they liked them, and they became quite popular.
And how long were you with the oil drum then?
Well, I have to go and look at exactly the years. What happened was that there was this kind of a situation of, well, Gail's a little too powerful and she's not telling the right story. The right story is oil prices will go through the roof and everything, we got to find some replacement for oil. And she's telling this story about low prices and she's talking about financial things. So she's not telling the right story, and people are paying too much attention to what she's saying. So, we want it divided up more evenly. And so everybody has a chance to be an editor and everybody votes on what things go up. And I said, well, fine, I'll go back to Our Finite World and I write my articles on Our Finite World. If you like them, you copy them over again. In fact, you hire somebody to copy them over again because they use slightly different versions of HTML. And so that's what I did. And I continued to be an editor over there. I mean, I was still listed as an editor, and I was an editor, but we voted, and unless it got enough votes, they wouldn't vote on it. It wouldn't actually be published. And that way they could make sure that, something that was unpopular didn't get published.
Now, the listener might be curious at the moment, how does an understanding of energy relate to things like financial collapse?
Well, the situation is, as I've kind of figured out, even though I'm not coming with a physics background, is that the economy operates under the laws of physics. I'm probably not the best one to exactly describe how this works, but you know how a human grows and they take in food, and food is their energy source. And we know we have hurricanes and they take in heat from the hot water that they go over. And so you have them during the summer and they go over land. And as they go over land, they lose their power and they dissipate. And there's various other things. Stars are also what they call dissipative structures. But the economy, and in fact, different kinds of ecological things, groupings too, trees are too dissipative structures. And it's not necessarily, with people, you don't necessarily die. There are many reasons you die, not just that you starve to death, for example. And so there can be reasons that an economy would come to an end, that it's not that they had too little energy. But if there isn't enough energy, what tends to happen is they tend to collapse. And the collapse comes from low wages. It doesn't come from high prices.
By collapse, do you mean vanish entirely?
No, not necessarily. I'm thinking what can happen is like with the Soviet Union, where the top layer of the government, is saying, oh, we've got so much debt and things are not going well and whatever all happens. I'm sure I don't have the right explanation exactly. But
This was 1986 about?
No, it was 1991.
Okay,
but they were kind of going downhill for a while before this happened. And that happened when there were low oil prices before and they were an oil exporter. But so what happens if there's not enough is that the countries that are dependent on the oil especially tend to collapse, but it can be with the one group just saying, well, we're leaving you alone. The next layer down can each have their own currencies. And so it would be like the European Union saying, okay, France, you're on your own again. Italy, you're on your own again. We're just not having a European Union again. And we just dissolve that later. So it wouldn't necessarily be that everything collapses all the way down. It could be that if it happens, say at the United States level or Canada level, that some of the states or some of the provinces could group together and say, well, we've decided we can make a better go of it by ourselves than with that other group.
And right here, I'm going to interject my feeling. Everybody who's in the Great Lakes Basin, let's join up. Because we've got something, we've got the Great Lakes Basin. So if rainfall from your house ends up in the Great Lakes or the St. Lawrence Seaway, we're in this together. In fact, I think all the watersheds, the macro watersheds, the mega watersheds should be together in this. So energy but collapse could be more like national governments might say, this is the end, or they become ineffective for whatever reason. So then whatever the next lower level of government becomes the one that's really.
They have to handle it themselves. They say, we don't have enough money for Social Security. We'll just give those programs to the states and you could continue them in whatever way you would like to, but we can't quite make a go of it. And if you're a rich state, maybe you can have the program, but if you're a poor state, well, you probably have a lesser program.
So I mean, the logical sequencing here would be then like the global economy, then the national governments, then the state, as in United States governments, and then the county governments, and then the cities and townships, and then we're down to neighborhoods, and then we're down to communities.
Something like that, right.
Communities, then neighborhoods.
The top layer would really be the things like United Nations and World Trade Organization and all of those kinds of organizations. And I think they're running into headwinds as well, because they have to get tax revenue essentially from all of these countries that are doing increasingly poorly. And if you're doing poorly, you figure out, who can you cut out of your checkbook? And you say, well, do we really need that next layer up?
This reminds me of the WHO and how the United States is apparently suggesting there's a chance that the US will stop sending money to the WHO.
If you look at their funding, they get most of their funding is not from governments, it's from other organizations. And of course, you always have then this kind of a thing that I ran into in the oil drum, even though we're dealing with people who are, not for profit and such, it's still, they're beholden to whoever it is contributes to them. So if they're, interested in having the drug makers contribute to them, or even some of these do-good organizations, You have to be following whatever agenda the organizations that contribute to you provide.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about whose work upon do you build? Like I have a bookshelf right here, and I can say, you know, I've got Daniel Quinn, and I've got Peter Singer, and I've got M.K. Gandhi, and I've got Michael Schumann, and Rob Hopkins, and Pat Murphy, and Lester Brown, and James Howard Kunstler, and Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and you know, all sorts of people. Whose work do you follow? Whose work has been helpful in you understanding what all is going on?
Well, I would say, Dennis Meadows, who I met way back when. Actually, he was one of the people who contributed to the oil drum, and I corresponded with him as an editor back then, and then met him in person later on.
And what was his main book?
Limits to Growth in 1972. It was actually his wife, Danella, who was the lead author, but she died quite a few years ago.
I actually have that one just there, but I can't say I've read through the whole thing.
Yeah. And then Charlie Hall, who is the head, who was involved with the energy return on energy invested. He was one of the people who had invited me to come and give a talk to his group after he'd read some of the things I wrote in the oil drum. I had forecast the crash in 2008 ahead of time. And I had made a long list of what all was going wrong. And he said, well, can you come and explain, you know, how you understood these things, you know? So I came to talk to his energy group then. And
was that the ASPO, Associations for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas, or was that a different organization?
They're not, you know, it's more of an academic group.
Okay.
Yeah, of course, the ASPO, yeah, the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, I was involved with them back when they were in operation, and you know, would correspond with them and would speak at their conferences too. But then they went, the oil drum and ASPO went the same direction. They collapsed. No, but resilience is carried on, of course.
Where's Charlie Hall now?
He lives out in Montana. He's in his late 70s, and his health is not great, but I still correspond with him on, you know, I'm on the board of his journal, and I have a peer review I'm supposed to be doing on one of the articles that's written for the journal right now.
What's his journal's name?
Well, it goes under the, oh, don't ask me. They just changed it.
Okay.
It went under the initials BERQ. But anyhow.
Okay. So Dennis Meadows, Charlie Hall, anybody else whose work you think is kind of critical to understanding, like putting together the proper understanding of things to be able to kind of see.
Well, what's happened with my website is that I think of it as a self-organizing system, just like the economy is a self-organizing system. It attracts a group of people who are interested in these subjects. And so these people say, oh, okay, we have, you know, I'm aware of a book on, you know, the study of ancient collapses, for example. And so I would follow the reference into that. Or, you know, so there have been a number of different people and different groups, and they don't necessarily know each other. And so, and I've been involved with, well, I probably don't have it on the tip of my tongue, some of the groups. There is a a different energy group that's out of Florida that I have been, anyhow, but I've been involved with all kinds of these groups and different ones that would just write to me too. But anyhow, I know I went down to University of New Mexico, or they wrote to me and they said, we have a series of different guest lectures coming in. Could you come in and stay and talk to our graduate students for 2 days? And I said, well, exactly what are you doing? And, you know, and it turns out, right, so they agreed that I'd come down there for 2 days. And they had a list of 12 lecturers who were coming in during the semester. And all of the others were from big universities, and they had PhDs after their name, and they, you know, were in some area or the other. And then they had Gail Tverberg, Our Finite World. And when I came down there, they had to move the talk to a bigger room because they didn't have room for everybody where they usually had those lectures.
So it sounds like you have, in a self-organizing way, made through your website kind of your own little nexus or node of information.
Right, right. And I haven't really written a book, which makes it a little difficult for people to follow, but you know, it's been one of these things where it's changing, and I haven't felt like I was a great expert in any one area. And if you spend a year writing a book, you're then a year out of date. And you can't do, you know, and I was looking at my website and I'm saying, well, I'm getting huge number of views on my website. And, you know, all of these academic books would write to me and say, will you write us a book? And, you know, Charlie Hall's group especially, and say, we'll pay you $1,000 if you get it. And we'd be real happy if it sells 1,000 copies. And I'm going, I get a lot more than 1,000 hits a day on my website. You know, do I care about writing this book? You know, it was difficult, and you knew that if you did sign up with them, they're not going to be able to give you very much financial or support in the way of editing or anything else. It's going to be, well, it will be okay, but it will appeal to a group who can pay $100 for a book.
Yeah, I haven't written a book on this topic either. I mean, I have any number of ideas. Like I was just thinking earlier today, wouldn't it be so helpful if people just understood how to create money? So if they don't have money, they can create it on their own. I'm not talking about counterfeiting dollar bills or pesos or anything, but just creating money and the basis on which that needs to be created on. I mean, there are some other similar works, but there's nothing that's geared like for the 8th grade level reader, you know. So, and I think that's where one of the big, it seems like that's like the level that things need to be at so that it's available to high school grads and college grads and, you know, basically anybody, so they can really understand this stuff.
Yeah, I know I've had relatives who've said, you know, well, I had to sit and, you know, I'd read your blogs, but I'd have to go, you know, look up so many words. It got kind of difficult.
Yeah. What is, Gail, in the most general definition, an actuary? And what is the job of an actuary? And what makes for the best actuary there could ever be?
Well, let's say that when I was a math major in college, you know, they'd always say, well, you know, what can a math major do? And they'd say, well, you can either teach or you can become an actuary. And okay. And all I had ever heard of was actuaries who were involved with life insurance and with pensions. And I thought, you know, I'm not really too interested in that. They were involved with setting rates and putting together financial statements for pensions and figuring out, you know, how much to charge for annuities, that kind of thing. But then I discovered that there were also property casualty actuaries that were involved with other kinds of coverages, such as medical malpractice or workers' compensation or automobile insurance or some kinds of credit insurance, homeowners insurance, a whole variety of other things. Now, what actuaries do depends a whole lot. Traditionally in the life insurance area, a whole lot of company presidents are actuaries by training. And that you work your way up through an insurance company, because these are the people who know what's going on in the insurance company. They have an overview of how it all fits together. And they're the people, but they can also be involved in very little minutia of, we'll write a program and we'll do all this data mining to try to figure out what we can tell of how we can differentiate our policy in a little way from somebody else. So as there get to be more actuaries within a company, then they do different tasks. I think there might be some actuaries who got outside of the insurance realm. I think there are a bunch of them that are quants who are in, you sometimes hear about these that have to do with derivatives, the pricing of derivatives. All of these interesting little things that are on the edges of finances, but you end up with different things. The actuarial field in the United States, I'm not sure, it varies a little bit around the world, is broken out into the life and the property casualty. And the way it works is usually after college, or maybe it's after graduate school, people will decide to study to become an actuary. Well, actually, and they will take a series of examinations. And it's the series of examinations that you have to pass to become an actuary. And it's about 10 exams. It varies a little depending on how you count them. If you have a 1A, 1B, and 1C, then, and you take them 3 separate times, you might think it's more than one exam, for example. But, and so it doesn't go through the university system. And the traditional way of doing this is people work and they study for exams at the same time. And they may take the first couple exams while they're in school, but beyond that, they tend to take the exams and work at the same time. And the pass ratio, when I was taking them, when I was grading exams, was about a third on the exams. And these were people who had master's degrees quite often. So we're not talking just your, guy that's goofing off. These are people who've been studying for it. So the exams were terribly hard. And so there are very, very many dropouts from it.
So would you characterize professional actuaries as good at math?
They're good at the kinds of, they're good at math, yes, but not, there's so many different kinds of math. My husband has a PhD in math, and he does all kinds of, or does or did all kinds of different things at math than what I was involved with. Once we got Excel and such things, and we were really good at Excel, or I was, but I've run into a lot of actuaries who use different kinds of programs as well, and who write programs, for example, because they are, they're modeling and they're using some modeling software, or they're running their own models.
So what does actuarial, is it called actuarial science?
Right.
What does it have to do with probability, risk, forecasting, prediction, and the future in general?
Well, a big part of what it has to do with is somebody, when you've got a problem, somebody has to step back and figure out, well, how are we going to even approach this problem? and where is their risk and how does it all fit together? And so actuaries were very much involved with just this whole, what problem do we have here? And how does it work? And, it's not so much that they need such difficult math, it's they need to understand the problem in the first place. And so then trying to put together an understanding, of what we do to make it all work out. And that's why you get the actuaries, at least some of them, ending up as presidents of companies and things, because they have a kind of an overview of what's going on. But, if somebody comes to you and they say, well, we want to sell a medical malpractice program to guarantee the results of international surgeries. People go to Brazil or they go to Southeast Asia to have their surgery done because it's so cheap. And we want, some kind of a policy on these doctors, if you have surgery done, that we want to have some kind of coverage for these people in case they get injured. Now, we'd like to know what kind of costs would you, what should we charge and how do we structure this program? You're going, oh yeah, this is a little different. We're thinking about that one. But, you're sort of like, well, or, they come and they'd say, well, somebody has a tort reform proposed. Okay, now how much do you think this tort reform will do? And how
Remind me, what is a tort reform?
Well, this would be a limitation on liability. For instance, if a baby is delivered in a hospital and something goes wrong, how much can you sue the doctor for, or how much can you sue the hospital for?
So an example in Michigan is that the state legislature recently passed a law where if you are injured in a car accident, there is now, it used to be the insurance was that everyone who had car insurance was basically paying into this fund. If someone was injured, all their bills were paid for the rest of their life, no matter what the injury was. And recently, people were very upset about the high rates compared to other states. And so the legislature with the governor changed the law. So this coming end of June, actually 1st of July, people can opt for how much they want to have covered if they are seriously injured in an accident or something like that. So they're
Yeah,
I don't know if that's the same as tort reform or if you followed that at all, but
that's the kind of thing actuaries get involved with. Is anytime any of these things come up and, well, how much credit do you give for this kind of deductible or any kind of thing of that sort, get involved in any of these decisions, and of course they put together these long-term care policies that you've heard about that were so disastrously priced because they, looked at it and said, oh, we only have a few people who are in assisted living centers. There won't be very many more in the future, probably, even if we're providing coverage for this. And we think the interest rates will stay high. Well, maybe it didn't turn out that way. And maybe if you pay for it, a lot more people will go to the assisted living centers. So, some of these things have not worked out terribly well.
So can you kind of explain that as far as what you just said, as far as income, expenses, interest rates, and how the three of them are related to one another?
Well, what would happen is that people would pay in a certain amount as a premium, and the insurance companies would invest those funds. And usually for casualty insurers, it's usually in bonds. They can't invest in stocks very well. For pensions, it tends to be more divided, And in fact, a lot of the pensions don't go through insurance companies. So their effect is, I think they have more flexibility, and it depends on who's regulating them as to how it works. But the interest rates, if you're saying, oh, we're going to make 8 or 10% a year on this, and you're going to pay it 20 years from now or 30 years from now, if it's somebody who's, 35 or 40 who's taking a long-term care policy out, you have a long time to earn interest on it. And then you're also looking at, well, how much is, say, assisted living going to cost at that point in time? And what percentage of the population or what percentage of policyholders are going to actually make use of this? It's really easy to bias your estimates towards the way the things are now rather than the way they will be. Of course, your employer is busy saying, well, we don't want the rates too high. We'll never sell any of these policies, if it's
Because you're in competition against other companies.
Right.
To have the lowest rates, but still not too risky.
Not too risky. Well, anyhow, to sell the policies. Well, at any rate, so you end up with this situation. So the people who got I got involved with medical malpractice at a time when they were going from a situation where babies who were delivered in 1974 or delivered, very early, and when they reached age 21, then they could file suit against the hospital. The policies that they, or the doctor, if the doctor had delivered the baby in whatever, 1970 or 1975 or whatever it is, 1980, and if something went wrong, the child had till 2 years after they reached legal majority, instead of, which would be 21 plus 2 years, when 23, to file a lawsuit against the doctor or hospital.
Like if during delivery, the child's arm was cut off or something like that, or?
Well, it had, more of the fights were about, the incubator had too low or too high a level of oxygen and they're blind.
Oh.
That kind of thing.
Forceps or things like that, or
that there could be some injury during birth, although I think there I'm not sure exactly how that would work. It would be some sort of a permanent injury that lifelong injury. And so what would happen is they'd have to file this lawsuit long after the fact. And of course, the policy was written, this is at a time in the 70s. Remember, you were talking about inflation rates that were, 5, 6, 7% a year. And so what was happening was that the insurance companies couldn't possibly pay these claims that were so many, they were not reported till so long after the premium was put in. The premium was paid at the time the baby was born.
by the parents or by the hospital?
Well, the hospital would have its policy and the doctor would have their policy, yeah. So it would be paid then, and it was on what they called an occurrence basis, which was—
So per birth, based
per birth. Yeah, right. So, but if you had to wait 23 years to figure out when your claims came in, and things changed in between, that was sort of a little problem.
So what happened to this industry then?
Well, they switched to a claims-made basis, a policy that only covered the claims that were reported in a given year. And so that you would not, and so then once the person retired, then they were supposed to buy a tail policy, and then we would see whether people actually, come back and try to sue this guy who has already died, for example, or whatever.
So we're talking about insurance for medical malpractice,
That
basically.
was for medical malpractice, but workers' compensation had the same kind of an issue. Workers' compensation, I know I looked up one claim, and it was somebody who was in a mental hospital, and I think he was 90 years old, and he'd been injured when he was, we'll say 18, when he got hit on the head. And he was in a mental hospital from the time he was 18 until he was 90. And it pays 100% of your medical expense. And if you're in a mental institution, it would pay all of that cost, and it would include all of your other medical expenses while you were stuck there for that entire time. And of course, that went against whatever premium was paid when he was 18 years old.
So let's turn to some really specific questions that the viewers might be interested in. And we might shift back to looking more at actuarialness later on, but what are your thoughts on insurance plans right now?
Well, the issue with insurance plans or banks or any of these things is that they're all promises. And they all depend on the whole system working. And it's not necessarily that anybody's doing a bad job or anything. It depends on the whole economy working. And so right now, the plan of all of this money printing and all of these new debt that's going on is that we're going to keep everything going the way it is. We have a certain amount of goods and services. I mean, goods and services are something that you can look at. You can say there's so much food in the grocery store, and you've got, so many places in the college, and you've got so many cars made, and you've got so many cell phones, and you know what goods and services are. And those are made with resources of different kinds, and they're made using human labor. But all of these promises are just ways of dividing up all these goods and services. And if you don't really have enough of these goods and services, then you've got a problem. And
that sounds like a hyperinflationary situation.
Well, that's what you say, is it's a hyperinflationary situation. Actually,
well, and Peter Schiff and a number of the people who are in maybe not the mainstream media, but the financial media talk about, oh, it's hyperinflation, all this money that's being created by the federal government, and all this money that's going to unemployment, and all this money that's being spent, like the $1,200 per person. This is going to be hyperinflationary. The prices are just going to go up on everything, and money's going to be worth nothing. And you better get out of the dollar, and you better buy gold, or you better buy hard goods or something, because your dollars are going to be, you may as well just burn them a year from now.
Well, it doesn't exactly work that way. The way the physics of the situation is, it comes out sort of upside down. Instead of prices going up, what happens, and it really is as you get more and more technology, as you get more and more specialization, as you get, the need for some people at least to go and get advanced degrees and things, that you get more and more wage disparity, and you get a bigger and bigger percentage of the population that's not earning enough, that they get a degree from college and they can only get a minimum wage job, for example, or they do have a job and they get laid off. And so the big problem you get is these layoffs and such things. Now, you can try to put in debt, and the government can print all of this money and make all kinds of promises, But as a practical matter, you can't, the government can't print more food in the stores. You know, it can't print more paper towel and toilet paper. And so what happens is that the system tends to fall apart. If we go back and we look at his history, what's happened is that a lot of economies have grown for quite a few years, and they are able to grow when they are able to find a new resource that they can exploit. And fossil fuels, for example, would be such a resource. And so we started utilizing coal, especially back in the early 1800s. I think England was even before then. But as we were able to use more coal and then oil and natural gas and nuclear and all of these other things that are derivative off of the fossil fuels, it allowed us to build more and more goods and services. But at some point, what happens is this whole complexity, this need for specialization gets to be too much. You have this situation where there are indeed a few people who are the 1%. They get way, way, way too much out of the total. In fact, they end up owning a lot of the new physical goods that we have, these new fancy, well, these companies, but also the fancy machines that we have. But what happens is that there are a large number of others who don't luck out that way. And it's the fact that there are too few who can buy that become the problem. And what tends to happen is there get to be a lot of debt defaults. All of these people who've had their trips to Europe or whatever canceled this year because of the coronavirus. You get a huge amount of situations where the value of that trip now sits on the balance sheet of some company that you are sure is not going to be there a year from now. They say, oh, you can use it next year. Well, yes, you can if they're still in business. So what happens is there's an awfully lot of defaults on debt that are happening now. And that's what helps bring the prices down at the same time that people are talking about the hyperinflation. I think the only place you get the really big inflation is probably on food prices and toilet paper and a few essential goods. But when it comes to other kinds of things, even if somebody tries to charge a higher price, there aren't enough buyers who can afford it. I saw something about airline prices would need to go up by a factor of 9 to accommodate all of this social distancing. Well, you can imagine how many airline seats they will sell if they have to charge 9 times as much.
What do you think this all implies, like going to like really, really practical questions? Where we're at right now in history, May 21st, 2020. What does this all imply for the airline industries? What would not surprise you? What do you think the risks or probabilities are?
I'm afraid that the airline industries, it's going to be part of what collapses. I'm sure we would like to keep at least, some airlines going so that it's not just US Air Force One or whatever taking the precedent someplace and somebody who owns a corporate jet taking something someplace somewhere. But I'm afraid a lot of these companies are going to go bankrupt and have to stop operations completely.
you seem to be implying that if someone has bought an airline ticket already that had to be postponed, or if they're making plans for flights right now for a year from now, because you can make, I think you can make reservations usually a year out. That's the maximum. What are your feelings about people that are buying or have these promises for a year from now or 6 months from now, or, you know, whenever you want to go for your flight, we'll redeem your flight?
Yeah. Well, I know I personally have, credits with Delta, on these things that, we're sorry you had to cancel your flight because this convention got canceled, but that's, it's good until such and such date, you're just dependent on them being around to pay it back. I think there might be some possibility with at least some airlines that you can get it back if they canceled it as opposed to you canceled it. But there are a whole lot of people out there with credits on the balance sheets of these companies, and they're not making a go of it right now.
How about all the people who had cruises booked, but then the cruise liners aren't even going to start moving until August or September?
I imagine they're getting nice little letters saying, and guess what? We have all of these cruises available for next year. We think, we're hoping. And in fact, I'm getting a whole lot of things from, Marriott Resorts. Why don't you invest now in some of these vacation properties? We'll give you really a good discount deals. You can buy ahead on this while prices are low.
So is this an issue where the promises that you're paying for are not really promises you should be trusting?
You shouldn't be trusting. Yes, there are lots of those around nowadays.
This sounds a lot to me like a Ponzi scheme.
Well, the whole system we've been living in looks a whole lot like a Ponzi scheme. It's the sort of a situation where, at one point, the world economy was able to grow very rapidly. That was back in the 1950s and the 1960s and even into the 70s. It was able to grow very rapidly. But then as costs of oil and other resources went up, it hasn't grown so rapidly, but you could substitute debt and more debt and more debt. And that more debt and more debt and more debt looks very much like a Ponzi scheme.
Talk about pension funds. Like I'm a retiree as well, and I get a pension check of about $2,000 per month from the state of Michigan. And then there's also people who have private pensions through corporations or, non-government agencies.
Right.
Tell us about pensions, especially not just for the current pensioners like myself, but for, I'm a retired teacher, for the teachers who are not yet retired.
Well, I think it's very iffy, how long these will last. I don't expect them to last very long because.
Very long as in a day, a week, a month, a year, 10 years?
Well, the problem is that as the economy gets more and more squeezed, and I'm thinking it's more and more layoffs because, we're hearing now, for example, that the hospitals are busy laying off workers because they are losing so many of their emergency room visits and their elective surgeries and things. They can't afford to hire as many people, so they're laying off workers.
Can I tell you a story about that?
Okay.
So where I live near Grand Rapids, Michigan, the largest healthcare system is called Spectrum Health. And so they have about 1,000 doctors that are employed through the system.
Mhm.
They send out a letter to all the doctors and said, something to effect that you're only going to be able to work for us now, and you're going to be paid. I don't want to say this wrong, so I'm going to stop with there. But it was basically you either sign or your salary is going to be reduced to 75% of what it is.
Mm.
And then another doctor told me this face to face, that he was told his salary was going to be reduced to 90% of what it had been. And he wasn't even a full-time doctor.
Mm.
And one of the other things was that the staff at the hospital were told, our revenue is much less, but we're all in this together, so we're all going to take a lower salary.
Right. Yeah. Well, my husband teaches at Kennesaw State University, and they're cutting a large number of classes. And one of the classes he's teaching is being cut. And because he's part-time, he's paid by the class, so his revenue gets reduced correspondingly.
The teachers, again, we're May 21st, 2020. The teachers and other public education staff have started to notice there may be issues with state budgets in the fall. Like in Michigan, for example, the state budget is supposed to be passed by both chambers of the legislature and signed by the governor by the 30th of June. So that's about 39 days from now.
Yeah.
And in that, it's supposed to say, well, for the teachers, the public schools, the school aid fund, this is how much you're going to get per pupil. So the lowest school was guaranteed, the school that had the least income from the state used to be guaranteed around $7,000 per pupil per year. That's for a full-time student, K-12. But I wouldn't be surprised, and I think this is already in the wind, that the revenue's not there, which means that that fund is, they're going to try to protect the fund so it doesn't go down too much. And really, it's kind of a balanced budget fund. It's just funded a bit in the future. But it sounds like that's very reasonable to imagine that there's going to be a lot of budget cutting, a lot of layoffs, and a lot of requests for taking haircuts, so to speak, as in lowering one's salary or paying more of one's insurance or
Whatever, yes.
working during their planning hour, whereas they weren't before, things like that.
Right, right. Yeah. And the pensions, as these governments what they're supposed to be doing is paying these pensions. The pensions really don't have very much money put into them generally, because they were put together assuming interest rates would be a whole lot higher than they really have been. And so what has happened is they really don't have enough funds in them. So each year the government is supposed to be putting more money into them so that they can pay your salary, your pension rather, and these others. Well, these governments don't have that extra money to put in them. So at some point somebody says, well, we're sorry, but we have a problem. And I think you've heard some stories about, should states be able to go bankrupt? And as I understand it, this whole discussion about states going bankrupt is very much tied to states that cannot pay all of their pension promises. Can they just default on these pensions?
And so all of our teachers who we have as friends on social media who are drawing off their pension right now, and who thought that they would be set for the rest of their life with health insurance and with a pension,
You can't,
who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s.
you can't count on this. No, it's the kind of thing that if something has to change, it will change. And you don't know exactly what snaps, but something is going to have to snap within the financial system as a whole. And you wonder, what snaps, the European Union could snap, and you can go back to all of the individual currencies of the different countries, and the European Union, well, I guess the debt there is of individual countries, but here, if something snapped here, you could end up with a situation where, these different states would be up to them as to, well, what if you can find it, fine, but if you can't, well, I guess you're just going to have to tell these people goodbye, and there's only going to be so much goods and services. And if there's not enough food to go around, well, you want to make sure that the people who are doing the farming and who are doing this stuff really get paid, and they can divide up their pay with whatever family members they choose to. But when it comes to trying to support hangers-on who are not really contributing much now, we just don't have means to do that anymore. So you worry that that's the direction things are going.
So I'd like to back up a little bit. In Michigan, the pension fund for the school educators is called MESPERS or something like that. It's handled through the Office of Retirement Services, and at one time it had $60 billion. But this was prior to some sort the stock market crash of 2007. After that, instead of 60 billion, and according to the actuaries, it was funded at like 90% or something, it only had 45 billion. And it's grown since then. But I've attended a couple of the public meetings in Lansing, the state capital, not recently, but I understand that the state legislature had said, Office of Retirement Services, you are to invest this money in such a way that you get an 8% return annually on the investment. The current employees, you pay in, well,
Yeah.
the school districts are told it's not the employees, but it's the school district that has to, they get the money from the state in this per pupil amount, but then per employee, they have to send back like 20% of that person's salary, gross salary, to the pension fund. But of course, in negotiations, I negotiated a school contract, a couple of them, you realize when you're on the labor side of the table that the school district has this limited revenue. And so it's per employee, you're really looking at per employee. And whether it's showing on the line of the school district that they're paying the pension portion, or if it's the employee paying the pension portion, or if it's both, which is actually the case.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be surprising to me that they say at the end of June, oh, well, I guess everybody's going to have to pay 5% more back.
Yeah.
Which is going to end up in a smaller salary, and it's going to cause this huge challenge at the bargaining table, because in Michigan, for example, not just Michigan, but many states, it used to be that each year you would go up as a teacher on the salary schedule, and you would increase by maybe $500 per year automatically.
Right.
And this was to even out like the amount of money that a male teacher versus a female teacher, an elementary school teacher versus a high school physics teacher. You know, if you have a master's degree, you're on this schedule with all the other people that have a master's degree.
Right.
It used to be that no matter what happened, if a new contract wasn't ratified, you went up anyway. You went up and up and up. If your insurance was paid at 80% or 90% by the district, it continued to be paid at 80 or 90%. But then in 2010-ish, it was made the opposite, which is wherever you're at is where you stay until a new contract is agreed upon.
Right. Yeah.
And whatever new costs for the insurance premiums, health insurance premiums, those do not convey onto the school district. That comes out of your salary.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine for those school districts that don't have a long-term multi-year contract, and even if they do, the ones that have a multi-year contract, that's going to lead to layoffs. The ones that don't, that's going to lead to salary reductions. And that's assuming if everybody goes back into the classroom. I mean, if people don't go back into the classroom, the layoffs would be a lot easier because they could say, hey, John, for example, your class size is now 45 because you're doing online anyway.
Right. Yeah. And I fully expect that that's what's going to happen is, oh, well, COVID's going to still be around, we think. And so teachers, we'd like you to do a class size of 45. We don't need to worry as much about substitutes either, because if you've got a cold, you can still teach when you're doing this online anyhow. And we don't have to worry about physical education. We don't have to worry about all kinds of little details, probably not too many art classes anymore. So we will just make do with a skeleton staff, and we're going to lay off a bunch of teachers too. And we'll continue to do it online. And that saves us, and we don't have to have janitors either much anymore.
But then the problem is the pension fund, which is paying the current pensioners, that fund is getting the revenue from the current employees because the money goes from the state to the employees into the fund and then to the pensioners. So now you have two pressures. You have less revenue into the fund and you're trying to earn 8% interest in the market. And what are your thoughts on 8% in the market or even 6% in the market?
Well, what happens when these pension funds are trying for an unrealistic goal, which all of them are, is they say, well, I guess we'll have to do it all with, stocks, or I don't know if they're allowed to go into ETFs or whatever it is, but we're not going to, we can't buy bonds because that's not going to give us very much. But of course, we know now that, say, airline bonds aren't probably worth a whole lot, and there's probably a lot of other bonds that aren't worth a whole lot. So no matter what they do, they're going to have a hard time getting 8% just because there's too many things going wrong. Bonds defaulting, stock prices going straight down. Well, they've gone up recently with all of this money printing, but at some point, something starts, we have more and more layoffs as the year progresses, as we get more medical care providers laid off, as we get more teachers laid off, as the local government stopped doing as much road repair because they just can't afford it, all of these things going on at the same time, it keeps pushing these things down. And so you end up with more and more pressures on it.
The other thought I had when you mentioned bonds was that in Michigan, at least, the school construction industry is a big industry, and it has been for the past, I don't know, many, many years. And so they will come to a school district and say, hey, do you have more students? Do you need a gymnasium? Do you need a new middle school built? Do you need a new, whatever? And you can go to the taxpayers with this bond request for 2 mils, 3 mils, and then for 20 years or 30 years, whatever. And the rates are really low right now. It's only 3% or 2% or whatever. And the school district will get this revenue in, in the tax payments for the local property taxes, and then they pay this
Right.
annually. What are your thoughts regarding that sort of thing?
Well, for a little while, you know, as long as we can kind of convince ourselves that this is a temporary problem and everybody can keep convince things that everything is temporary, then there probably are still going to be some people who can go out and try to sell these bond programs and say, well, we've got these, maybe you've got more children. I just read the birth rate was down yet again this year. And we know that that there aren't as many immigrants either. So you can't, population growth is not going to be going up all that much, but they're still going to promise these things and try to build them. But I expect that the construction is going to go down. I know that.
Well, and who owns these bonds?
Who owns these bonds? Well, you know, you end up with pension, you know, insurance companies, pensions own these bonds. There's a variety, it gets buried deeply into the whole fabric of the whole system. You know, that
so if these bonds were, like if the school districts were not getting in the amount of money that they thought they were going to be able to pay, is this could be a problem for the bond holders in this case, right? Which could include the pension fund itself.
Right. What they thought, you said that it had 60 billion in it. And
at one time, yeah.
And it went down to 45 billion. Well, it could go down a whole lot more, you know, either with the value of stocks dropping or with the bonds defaulting, or whatever other things that they're allowed to put in the pension fund. Some of them can have real estate in it too, I believe.
So we've talked about pensions for states. How would that be the same or different for municipalities or counties or cities or towns or townships or other smaller public entities smaller than a state?
Well, you still have the same problem. And I know I just read about another city in Alabama that declared bankruptcy. And I think that these bankruptcies are very often related to pensions.
So you wouldn't be surprised to see more of that.
More bankruptcies, right, right.
Then how about for corporations then? I mean, there's corporations big and small that have pension funds.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to see a whole lot of corporations that are going bankrupt, period. And the ones with pension funds are probably especially going to go bankrupt. You know, corporations mostly switched to things like 401c3s back quite a long time ago, because actuaries finally, you know, got wise to this whole thing. And they said, you know, there's no way we're going to keep up with this. These interest rates are going down. We're going to make sure that the employee gets stuck with this, not the employer. Of course, some of the teachers' funds and things didn't smarten up the same way, but
oh well, they did. In Michigan, for example, in 2000, if you were hired as a teacher in 2001, you were not in the full pension system. You were in it like half. You were half in it. So half was defined benefit. The other half was defined contribution into like a 403B. And then for the newest teachers, like 2015 or whatever, it's almost entirely like a 403B style thing.
Yeah, well, I think that the corporations tend to make that change sooner than the others did.
So what are your thoughts on, say you have a 40-year-old, healthy 40-year-old worker who has money in their 403B, their 401k, their IRA, their Roth-IRA. What are your thoughts regarding that?
Well, I didn't have been one who's been arguing, don't put money into these things. You know, you're never going to get it back out again. Something's going to go
Wait a
wrong.
second, you just said never. That's
Don't,
like really definitive. Why? Why never?
you'll never get it back again.
Why not?
If you're a ways away from retirement, you know, this thing is going to go away before you ever get there.
You seem so sure of this, Gail. I mean, like it's like the sun's going to rise again tomorrow, Aaron. It's like your degree of assurance is curious.
Unfortunately, it's sort of like, oh, we're just way too close to the edge, that there are too many things going wrong and too many places that are just too far gone right now. You know, China was in bad trouble before all of these things started happening long ago. I mean, they were in trouble back at the beginning of 2018 when they had to quit the renewables industry, which is pretty much quit it anyhow. That's when they stopped taking in all of our recycling and things. But China has been doing terribly. But then Europe has been doing badly. I was just looking at, I think it's Japan just had its second quarter of contraction. So its first quarter of contraction came before the end of the year. And I think that we've got some of the European countries that are sort of at that same point too. It wasn't that this was a whole new thing that was coming along. They were in bad shape to begin with. And at the same time, the interest rates are just at an unreasonably low level. And the quantity of interest and the quantity of debt, the amount that's being put out there now is just amazing. It's more than in the 2008 crisis. But it's this whole thing that you only have so many goods and services to divide up. And if the people who get them are mostly interested in getting food and toilet paper, then those prices will go up. But you're still going to have a whole lot of things. They don't go and buy new cars, for example. A lot of industries start going downhill at the same time, and it looks like there's going to become a snap in the whole system. You know, we know that a person, you know, I talked a little bit before that it's a hurricane tends to go downhill or tends to collapse when it goes over land, but a human tends to go downhill as they get toward the end of their lives. I think we're dealing with an economy that's going downhill towards the end of its life, at least in its current form. And it looks like something's going to snap. And, you know, there could very well be, you know, smaller snaps and then bigger snaps. I'm not quite sure what, but, you know, you could have the European Union have some major snaps, for example. And then later on have some snaps some other places. Or say Saudi Arabia with the low oil prices could face some kind of a collapse, or there could be an overthrow of the government just because the government can't fund enough programs for the people.
I'm going to insert a little remark here. First of all, if you're watching this after 83 minutes, thank you so much for all of you watching. If you could please do a thumbs up, that would be really great if you're logged in to YouTube. Also, subscribe and hit the bell to get notifications and emails. And if you want to put in a comment, if you're on live, you know, put something into the top chat box, and share stuff like this. This chat that I'm having with Gail right now follows just a few hours after my chat with David Korowitz, who talked about very similar concepts, Nicole Foss, who I talked with earlier this week, Alan Brown, who I talked yesterday about how to fix at least the money side of it, if not the energy side of it. Tom Greco, I talked to about a month ago about very local money, like Gail was talking about like really, really local. Robert Rapier, who I was talking with yesterday, also about risk. And so if you go on the Local Future Network and you look through like some of those names, David Korowitz, Nicole Foss, Steve Keen, Ellen Brown, Tom Greco, Robert Rapier, Gail Tverberg, this is not just, and this is just the people that I've been able to reach out to. So these are all related ideas, and there are some, Gail and I have been talking a lot about the near-term downsides, but you know, there are, like Gail was talking about, a collapse on the highest levels coming downwards. There are things people can do at a local level, like, you know, everybody getting out and growing their garden and make sure they're taking care of the essentials of their own existence, and local currencies or even state level currencies. And like Gail was implying, you know, the people that are able to earn income from one means of another, helping out their family members, because as far as the state pensions and those sorts of things, the amount of time those might be available is not necessarily a long time. So Gail, how about things like when we're talking about federal government, direct payments from the federal government, like these refund checks of the $1,200 and the unemployment benefits, which kind of channel through,
Right.
and the electronics food cards, like they used to be called food stamps, but now they're EBT, electronic benefit cards, or EBCs, and the Social Security checks. So these are all things where the government is just, you know, sending people money so that they can spend, and the government can do this basically infinitely. I know there's a whole complexity between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, but what are your thoughts on those sorts of things?
Well, I think the issue is that it really takes, you start getting supply lines breaking as this whole thing works out. You know, we're discovering more and more empty, or we're discovering at least some empty shelves in grocery stores. But also we're finding that Ford or the different auto companies are not making as many cars as they were making before. And there's not going to be as many cell phones made as were made before. So the total amount of goods out there keeps going down, and or will keep going down. And you can print all kinds of money, but if you don't really have goods, the two have to come together. You can't, you know, say, well, okay, you know, we're going to give you all this money, go spend it, except there aren't any goods out there. So the system doesn't work. And what seems to me to have to happen is they have to concentrate those funds in the hands of the people who are really working. So that what I would expect happens if there is a discontinuity, and so there's, say, no more euro, for example, and they have to go back to whatever, some other currencies, or if there's no more US dollar, or no more Japanese yen, or whatever it is, that if there are local currencies, those local currencies will have much less of a debt component in them. Then they will be more directed towards the people who are current workers. And so that those workers can actually buy the stuff that's currently being made. That's at least my expectation, because if there's not enough to go around, you've got to make sure you're taking care of the people who are really working on it. And if you have leftovers, then you can use it to fund your pension plans and do whatever all else, but it all depends on how much is left.
And I'm going to just point out that the things that we depend upon the most, at least those of us who aren't Mennonites and Amish and homesteaders, are water, food, sanitation, and shelter. And so people that provide those things for us, I mean, those are the most critical people. Number one, water.
Right.
Number two, food, which is farmers, especially, for example, my family purchases a share in a community supported agriculture. It's a farmer who grows all sorts of vegetables, and about 50 or 100 people pay her monthly a set amount. And then each week we go in and we get a basket of food based on what's grown. So that's something where we are directly paying that farmer. And so she has an income.
Right.
But anybody can grow food, just like during the wars, there's these whole victory garden movements where people would go out in their yards, and like even in the suburbs, even in the villages and cities where they said, oh, you can't plant stuff in the front yard. And they said, well, I'm going to eat, sorry. And planting, and this is a good time of year, May, to get out there and plant stuff. But again, you got to have the water. So hopefully for the people who live in places where it's rainy, and does this sound on the right track, or are you like, Aaron, you're just talking crazy now?
Well, I know out by my mailbox where I had pansies and things, well, I now have a couple of tomato plants and a couple of eggplants and a jalapeno bush. Now that's not going to provide many calories for us, but I've put those plus a few marigolds, so it's a little bit more practical things. I figure, well, if the neighbors don't like it, well, tough luck. I haven't been trying to impress the neighbors, so that's the way it goes.
When I was talking with Ellen Brown yesterday, and she's, if you go and listen to her talk, and I'm speaking mainly to the viewers here, you go listen to her talk with me. We chatted for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, planting fruit trees or nut trees. I mean, that would be something, I mean, it doesn't pay off instantly, but in addition to having a huge, beautiful organic garden, planting lots of fruit and nut trees, not just on your own property, but any property where anyone allows it, that's not a bad idea, because the US is dependent on a lot of things for the food supply system to work properly. Isn't that true, Gail?
Yes, but I discovered a catch to that. When I started getting into this, I said, okay, we'll take out the bushes along the one side of our property and we'll put in fruit and nut trees. And so I do have 2 peach trees and a fig tree and some hazelnut trees. Well, the hazelnut trees have never produced anything. They are not for the right climate for Georgia. It's possible I don't have it fertilized properly, but it's not working.
So this is not something that you can start necessarily today with no knowledge and expect this is going to work out well. I mean, this is something where you want to spend a few hours figuring it out first, what to plant, where to plant it, when to plant it, how to keep it going. And then for the trees, you can't guarantee that they're going to be productive 1, 2, 3, 4 years from now.
Well, it's worse than that. It depends on when your frost comes relative to when they bloom, whether you happen to have peaches or not. And you may have to spray in order to actually have peaches. The way the fig tree grows, unless you've pruned it right, the figs may be at too high a level for you to actually get to bring them back down again. To pick them off the tree. There's all these little details of how do you make this all work that are not there. I did try a supposedly cold hardy olive tree, and since you heard I did try it, it truly was not cold enough hardy for the Atlanta area, so it froze. So we took that out, and I guess that's where one of the peach trees are. But anyhow, these things don't necessarily work out. And in fact, yeah.
So reach out to your experts and see what they're growing in your neighborhood. the nearest master gardener.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, you've heard about Stone Mountain in Atlanta. I think
No.
all built over what's equivalent to Stone Mountain. You have a layer of maybe 3 inches of soil, and then you hit a rock, and that's all there is.
Gail, talk about near-term hyperinflation versus deflation.
Good question. I guess the big place where I see the inflation is in the foods and the things that we really want. The deflation is coming with all of the debt defaults and the commodity prices falling way too low. I'm afraid of things breaking. I think that's more what I have been concerned about. Maybe there's a 3-month or 6-month period of hyperinflation, but in the whole scheme of things, it's the fact that things break, that the system breaks, I see as being more important. But you say, oh, we're just not going to be having trade with these internationally because the currencies are just too unstable. Or as we were saying, if you no longer have the European Union, you no longer have whatever treaties you had with the European Union. You now have to deal with the individual countries. Or if you no longer have the Canada, you might have the provinces or some groups of provinces to deal with. And so these countries may be coming up with new currencies, and the old currencies that you thought were filling up your bank account and that your pension was payable in could just sort of disappear. It's not that it converts to this new currency, it's just not there anymore.
This reminds me of when General Motors went bankrupt and the president jumped in, he called everybody in, and it went bankrupt, and then they started this brand new separate company.
Mm-hmm.
The brand new separate company, and it had some weird name. The brand new separate company was funded by the federal government. They bought all the intellectual property from General Motors, not just all the intellectual property, but they bought the name General Motors, every brand, every trademark. They brought it all over to the new company. So the old company became Motor Liquidation Company.
Right.
And that company has all the bad stuff. So all the brown fields, all the bad assets that were just dragging on the company. The new company, and all the stockholders, of course, were wiped out because that's the company that they had stock in.
Right.
It was totally gone. If you had stock in GM, that GM, the old GM, the original GM, gone. The new GM, now they were able to issue stock after a while, and people bought that stock. And this is a totally different company. And the pension, there was the whole issue of, well, what's going to happen to all the pensioners in the old GM? I mean, and I don't remember how that worked out exactly, but this is the idea that jumped to mind as soon as you said, when this system goes away, it's not like those claims or those debts get transferred to the new system. They don't, because it's a separate system.
And there've been a lot of coal companies that have gone bankrupt. Well, the main thing they've been trying to do is to wipe out their pension plans.
Let's talk about some practical things as far as spending money for myself and for anybody who might be watching. Gail?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about maybe buying a house. This house is kind of small, and I'm thinking, hey, I've got some money in the bank. I'd like to buy a bigger house.
Well, and some people have pointed out, they're not going to throw you out of your house if there's nobody who can buy these houses. So If there's nobody who can buy these houses, you could just as well say, hey, that's not a bad idea. You know, if I'm going to be in a house and all of this debt is going to be forgiven, I could run my debt to the moon, because what difference does it make? You know, if my pension plan stops, I surely won't be able to pay it, but I probably have trouble with it right now. So, you know, maybe that's not all bad. Now, I personally would not do that kind of thing, but there are people who would do that. You know, they'd sit down and say, you know, nobody is right now, they're telling people you can't throw them out of the rental property. Well, I guess that's a little bit more hazy, but you can't, you know, the owners of the property can't throw out people, and the banks can't throw out people who are not making their mortgage payments. So if this is the way it's going to work, then your optimal way of doing things is play the system the way it looks like it works.
You're the first one to say that.
Well, no, but I mean, and as we can see, the energy prices are very low. It's not that the prices go to the moon. The big issue is that it's going to be cut off, that we just won't have the energy, that the electricity will be turned off. You know, what you're thinking about is am I going to live in this house without electricity, without a functioning water system? You know, what am I going to be doing in the future?
So this is implying to me that for someone who lives in a condo in a city, it wouldn't be a bad time to buy a place out of the city that has an acre or two.
It might not be. Yeah. I mean, you know, because the condo in the city is not necessarily a great place.
So, so the value of the condos in the city might fall a bit in the near term.
That's right. So the sooner you do this, the better.
This reminds me of the housing crash that happened during the Great Recession. How do you see this whole thing playing out as far as housing in general or in specific, either way?
Well, it's a good question. You know, in Atlanta, I was talking to some on the Zoom conferences to some real estate people I know, and they said, you know, we're getting multiple offers on houses right now with the low interest rates and things. You know, people are real interested in buying things right now. And I was just walking down the street and I saw a sign that said for sale by owner. And I'm thinking, some people are figuring this is the time to play it right. You know, I don't even have to pay a real estate commission because there's so many people who are, you know, Atlanta's being publicized as one of them that was saying, we don't want this closed down stuff. You know, maybe Atlanta's the place to be. But generally, though, this can't last for very long when you've got so many people laid off from work. And what's going to happen somehow or other is that the value of these houses is going to have to go down. You know, if you can't get rent from people, all you can get is the government saying, well, you can't kick out the people who aren't paying their mortgages. You know, this system is not going to go on for very long.
So you would not be surprised if the overall sale price of the homes dropped from whatever the current recent high has been, down by half, for example?
Something like that, yeah.
More than half?
It could be something like that, and especially if you're talking about a whole change in the system. You know, if there's some kind of a major discontinuity and there's a new, instead of a United States dollar, there's, you know, whatever new grouping of states currency, you know.
Great Lakes Basin bucks.
Great Lakes Basin bucks, yeah. I don't know what the value might be. It would be something different. It probably would depend on how close you were to good farmland. And you know, who cares about something in downtown Detroit?
Let's talk a little bit about cars. is this a, you know, I had a car for about 10 years. It was doing okay. And is this a great time to buy a new car? Hey, I can buy a new car or a used car, or should I maybe wait a few months?
Well, I understand that the auto companies are giving, no interest rates, deferred payments for umpteen years. So from that point of view, they're having a hard time selling them. So they're making good deals on it. There's, you'll get a really low monthly payment if you buy a new car.
And what happens if you default on a car payment anyway? They just come get the car, right? The repo men?
Well, that's one of those things we'll find out too, because I guess there's an awfully lot of car loans that are being defaulted upon. And I'm wondering if there's going to be lots and lots of used cars. And if they collect all of these used cars back and they can't get very much on them relative to what people paid for them, because I know they've been making loans for more than the value of the car. And so then when they've dropped in value, and now there's all of these people who cannot afford cars, who are they going to sell these cars to? It's very much related to the housing problem, in the rental car market, the rental housing market as well. You can't throw all these people out of their cars because you're not going to have anybody else to sell them to. So I'm not quite sure how it works out. It may very well be that the gas station has closed down because they're not making any money. So you don't have any place to get gas. So the car is no good,
It doesn't sound like necessarily a great time to buy an extra vehicle.
An extra vehicle, no. Now, if you're having problems with things breaking, I think it might be a good time to get a new battery and things that are breaking. But when it comes to buying an extra car, no, that doesn't make so much sense.
It's interesting because not far from us, we have one of those auto auction wholesale places where they have about 300 acres with just cars parked there. And then the dealers, the used car dealers will go and they'll look on the computer and say, hey, I need one of those and one of those, and they'll go auction them or whatever. But that place is full. All the car rental places are full. I saw a picture of like near LAX. They've got like cars up and down, the rental cars at the stadium, in the stadium parking lot, all these cars.
Right.
There's just so many cars. I can't imagine that the prices are going to stay. I mean, I think the blue book values are just going to decline like crazy.
Yeah, that's what you would think. Yeah, how in the world they've got more cars than there possibly are buyers, and they won't be able to repossess them later on. Well, maybe they can, but what's the point if you don't have anybody to sell them to?
So what would this imply as far as auto manufacturing, auto parts for auto manufacturers, all their suppliers?
Well, I think one of the big questions is whether there will be parts for these cars. If you have a big problem, if you've got a car and you're really missing something and you can't get the part for it, you may have to buy a new car as opposed to the replacement part that you thought you needed on this car. Although with used cars, usually you can get the car from a junk dealer or something. But if it's a fuel pump or something like that, you probably would like one that's in reasonable condition. Or new brakes or new whatever else it is that it takes to make it go.
Well, I actually bought a new used car, a 2017, I think, and it's sitting in the garage. I bought it at the start of February, and I've driven it about 10 times before I took the insurance off, because it was pointless because we were at home and my wife's also working at home and we had two vehicles. So why have insurance on two vehicles?
Mm-hmm.
in fact, I took the insurance off both of them. And then she was like, well, I really want to be able to drive to the store myself instead of the neighbors doing it. I was like, okay. So we put the minimum, rather than like full coverage, we put the minimum insurance on her car. And mine has like storage, like if the garage collapses on the car, in storage insurance. What are your thoughts as far as insurance companies? You understand like the various different insurance companies.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on like auto, home, life, whatever? I don't know all the categories.
Well, okay. You know, you have to think for auto and homeowners, those are things where the insurance companies provide some services to you. You know, if you've got an auto injury, you know, they're going to come out and help you at the time of the accident and such things, and help defend you if you get sued in court or however this all works. And I think you generally are going to want your auto and your homeowner's policy. You know, if somebody sets fire to your house, they may say, and because they're mad at you or something, they'll say, might try to say this isn't covered or something. But I think you do want your auto and your homeowner's policy as long as things are going.
What about from the insurance side of it though, from the actual people selling you in the insurance? I mean, what's the risk to them?
Auto,
Like in Michigan, we have farmers insurance, we have AAA
right,
insurance.
yeah, and auto and homeowners, it's very much the premiums you're taking in today are going to be paying claims day after tomorrow or something. I mean, you're paying your policies every 6 months or something, and they're not holding this funds for a long time. They don't have it sitting off in a lot of stocks and bonds, and they're not. So it's not an issue of playing the markets that way. It's much more of a pure function of trying to keep order in the whole society, whatever all. And I think since we're used to doing things this way, you know, there's some comfort, especially if you're concerned about crime rates going up or whatever going up. You probably do want a homeowner's policy, and you do want, you know, there are things that are going wrong, and it's good to have somebody to talk to and help you along through these difficult times. When it comes to pensions and annuities and such things, I actually have an annuity myself, and it's certainly not my only investment.
Now, just for anybody who's not entirely clear, an annuity is you pay in while you're working a little bit every month or year or whatever.
It can be that way, or you can just put it in a lump sum. But anyhow, yeah.
And then you start drawing, you at a certain age, they start sending you a monthly check or something. Is that how it works?
Or something of that sort. Yeah, they have all kinds of guarantees as to how much you're going to get or whatever it is. I guess my interest has been in diversification. And it's kind of this whole issue of, well, if the governments are going to bail out companies, who are they going to bail out? Is it going to be they're going to bail out the life insurance companies? Are they going to bail out the banks? Are they going to, you know, is it good to have some gold or silver or, you know, whatnot all? And you can diversify, you know, you can say, well, I'm going to invest my life savings in Amazon, and however they do, I will do. But to some extent, what you kind of have to do is diversify. And you say, well, I can't give you the right odds on which ones the governments are going to bail out and they're going to keep going. But we know the last time around, they didn't let AIG go down, for example. And they very well could have.
And they had a lot of life insurance and annuities, AIG.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, both my parents and my husband's parents had annuities from them. And they kept them going, you know? So you're going, well, maybe this is not an all bad idea. Because if you know that the governments before have kept those going, and that's been a priority, that's a way of diversifying. You know, you say, okay,
Could
well,
it have to do something with the people who are senators and representatives currently getting income from those annuities, that they are encouraged
I
to?
think it's sort of like you have to keep this too big to fail kind of issue. And you know, it's the, you know, what things do you let go and what things you not let go. At some point, they're going to have to let all of these things go, I'm afraid. And it's all of this stuff is maybe only a matter of, you know, weeks or months difference between one thing or another. You know, we don't know, you know, different ones have said, oh, we should have local currencies. Well, maybe so, but you know, your local currencies aren't going to help you buy anything from Japan, for example. And it won't, and debt is one of the big issues when you have with our current financial system, and most people have not really thought through the debt part of the local currencies. So, but I guess my thought has been mostly on diversification in terms of what you do with your investments. That way you covered yourself at least a little bit in different ways.
What are people doing? You have a blog. What are people doing to prepare for the future right now? Like in my case, we are doubling the size of our garden. We're increasing the size of our pantry. We're reducing our monthly bills. What are other people doing as far as getting ready for an uncertain future, a future where we're not really sure what's going to happen?
Well, I'm not sure I've been really pushing all of that. We've been talking mostly about appreciating what you have now. You know, and making the most of what time you have right now, because it's not clear that we can hold on to the future. And I'll have to admit, I do have my readers, well, they cover a wide age band, but I do have quite a few readers who you would think of would be in the retirement age right now. And, you know, unless they really have a big garden already, they're probably not going to go out and put in a big garden. You know, so it's kind of like, well, let's appreciate what we've got now. And you know, and there's so many things to appreciate right now, and take care of that, as opposed to trying to hold on to what you have and trying to, you know, how do we maximize every dollar and how do we maximize all of this? You know, if you've got money to give extra money, you should be giving it away to your children, because, and you've got grown children, because you may have to depend on them later. Or you might need to think about moving closer to, you know, extended family, for example, so that you can work together on things.
Or perhaps inviting them to live with you if you're the one that has the homestead.
Yeah, right. Somehow, right. Especially if you've got hardworking relatives, you invite them to live with you. Something like that. I'm not quite sure. But, you know, and you kind of figure this out, but we may have to have larger size households, right?
What do you think about people living in dry places like Arizona and New Mexico and those sorts of places?
Well, it sounds interesting. I would like to have a good supply of water if you live there. I think that would be my big concern, but obviously there were Indians that lived back there years ago, and somehow or other they made a go of it. I just don't know how they did it.
So it sounds like learning about some indigenous history and how people lived in that time
Right.
might be in some way convenient or helpful.
It might be convenient or helpful. Right, right.
Okay. Well, I think we've had a pretty, I mean, I feel like it's been a wide-ranging discussion. And what sort of things, what is your like your main thing that you feel like you know that the general people on average, the everyday worker who's busy at work, you know, most of the day, don't really know? I mean, what's the thing that you you understand that is a misconception amongst other people or a misbelief amongst them?
Well, I think that there's a very common misbelief, and I don't know if it's among the general people, but it's amongst all these researchers, so-called, is this belief that, oh, it's going to be scarce, so the price will be high, and we'll always have at least a little bit of oil around because there will be high-priced oil, and that will be available for anybody, and our whole system will stay together. So, you know, you'll still be able to turn on your water faucet and have the water come out, but it's not really that kind of a thing. The big issue is that that whole system tends to break, and the prices, instead of going up, they tend to go down. And when they go down, you get the failure of some of these governments and the services that those governments provided. You know, so it's a different problem than a lot of people have been focused on.
This reminds me of my actual car story, which is that I was driving to see my son at his wrestling meet at the end of February. And my car had about 200,000 miles on it. The oil light had been on for 5 years. It was broken or whatever. And the car stopped. The engine stopped. And I tried to get it started, and I coasted eventually to a off ramp. Couldn't get it started. Hybrid car, so it would like start and then it would stop, start and stop. Had it taken to the dealership, and I was figuring I was going to sell it for $4,000 soon, like within a month or two. Took it to the auto repair shop. They called me a few days later and say, well, it ran out of oil, and so the engine is froze up. And I said, well, how much is it going to cost to fix that? And he said, well, you can't fix that because, I mean, you'd be paying more than the car's worth. You would just go buy a different car. And so that car is still sitting there in the back lot, you know, after 4 months. I mean, it's still my car technically. I still have the title and everything for it, but sitting on that back lot, just sitting there, and there's nothing wrong with it except for whatever freezing up happened. You know, I could put oil in it. I could
work.
Right. So this reminds me of what you're saying. So now I have this. I mean, is that an analogy that works?
Yeah, I guess so. You know, that the whole system starts freezing up, and it becomes a very changed system. And this is the thing that the peak oilers missed, is that you have a system, you know, just like hurricanes come to an end, or humans die, or stars disappear. You know, the economy has a tendency to just completely change. And this has not happened recently, you know, so we don't anticipate it, but it could. It could change very rapidly overnight, practically. Maybe not overnight, but maybe it will be through a series of different changes in different countries over different time periods.
This reminds me of the books written by Joseph Tainter on the collapse of complex societies, and Jared Diamond, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. and they've looked at many different societies like Easter Island or the ancient Maya or the feudal Japan or Russia or Cuba. Is this kind of what you're thinking of, that all
Right, yeah.
all societies eventually get to a point where they are running out of energy? I mean, is that how you're describing it?
What happens is that the population grows too high relative to the resource base, which would be energy especially. And what happens is the cost of energy extraction rises, but the prices that the citizens within the are able to pay with this wage disparity goes down. And it's the fact that the wages are not high enough to pay for the higher costs of extraction causes this discontinuity, this breaking of the whole system. It's, you know, it's the fact you can't afford the higher costs. You know, if we could pay for $200 a gallon oil, we probably would be doing fine. We have all the oil we needed. We could get all the coal, all the natural gas, and everything would be great, but we can't.
Well, and these are not infinite resources, they're finite.
Well, yeah, they're not, right. You have to keep raising this price. And of course, you get pollution at the same time, and you get all of these other problems at the same time. There's nothing that really solves the problem. There's just too many people relative to resources, and it's sort of, we had the misfortune to, we had the fortune to be living at the time where things were as good as they would ever get to be. But at the same time, we run into the problem that we run into this discontinuity that comes at the end.
So again, I'd like to remind the viewers that these concepts play directly in with the talks that I had with David Korowitz earlier today, where he's talking about majorly the same concept. Right. Ellen Brown yesterday, where she's talking about local currencies, state currencies, even almost personal currencies. Nicole Foss, who I've been speaking with several times over the last month, and I have my next chat with her coming up on the 25th of May, 2020 at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And we're going to talk about a lot of these things. Robert Rapier, who I talked to yesterday about oil prices and risk and assessing risk, especially in light of the coronavirus COVID-19. Thomas Greco, who I talked to about a month ago about local currencies like within a village, or even a large grocery store could create a partial scrip currency. And finally, Steve Keen, who is probably the most well-known of any of the people I've spoken to, who has been talking about debt deflation, and in particular, the necessity perhaps of having a debt jubilee, just like was extremely common at a certain point in history. And Michael Hudson, economist, also talks a lot about that as well. So these are all related. You can look on my channel, and for those people, you can look on other channels as well, because there's lots of information. The Local Future channel has a lot of kind of solution side stuff as well, because, you know, all of our ancestors made it through all the way up to this point in history. So we've made it through collapses before, and depressions before, and recessions, and all of those things. So I guess back to Gail. Gail, what do you think is kind of the long-term view, as far as what do you see as far as the probabilities, and how are people going to be living in 10 years or 20 years?
Well, I really am not one to speculate very much on that. I guess
that's fine. You don't have to.
I see this more as, you know, as I look at this, I think there has to be a higher power that's behind all of these things that are going on. And I think that maybe it's time to make some reconnections with higher powers, as opposed to, necessarily figuring out that there is a way that we can fix this problem, and that yes, there will be people here 10 or 20 years from now, because we don't know that. It's a discontinuity we really don't understand at this point.
And my perspective, the side that I choose to go with, is that my grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, all the way back, they made it through every single one of them, every single one of the pandemics and collapses and deflations and depressions, and every single one. And for you too, the viewer, your ancestors did too. And this is going to be a hero's journey for each of us in our own lives to, I mean, it's going to be the adventure of our lives in a certain way. And adventures, no adventure comes without great challenge. So, yeah. I think it's, in a way, it's, I mean, it's scary and frightening, but it's also thrilling in the same way that kind of a roller coaster ride is scary and frightening and thrilling, you know.
Sort of, yes.
All right. Any final words before we sign off today, Gail?
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Hey, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the call with me, and especially enduring with all my not necessarily related sounding questions.
Thank you.
And for all the viewers, again, if you can hit the thumbs up and subscribe and notifications and put in a comment, whatever comment you want, like, hey, great video. Hey, watch this, important. Hey, go to David Korowitz's talk. That would be great. And share stuff like this. But again, keep in mind that not everybody's going to watch to the end. Please try not to freak people out too much. This sort of talk is not necessarily for everybody, and it's certainly not for a certain group of people who are already stressed out as it is right now. So thank you so much for joining, and take care.